In the conclusive part of the Precursors of the Romantic Revival, I begin with William Cowper, born in 1731 up to 1800. Cowper's first attempt at authorship, poem 1782, is written in the approved classical manner in a heroic couplet on subjects like the progress of error, truth, and charity. One of them, however, is a well known poem beginning, I am monarch of all I survey. His next work, The Task, 1785, is a long poem in blank verse and is perhaps the most famous of Cowper's works. The poem is divided into 6 books whose titles are respectively The Sofa, The Timepiece, The Garden, The Winter Evening, The Winter Morning Walk, and The Winter Walk at Noon. It deals with simple and familiar themes and contains many beautiful passages on country scenes and country thoughts. Cowper's observation is acute and humane, and the common, homely scenes have been described with insight and sympathy. There are many fine descriptions, or rather, there are many fine descriptions of nature, real nature, not nature viewed through the spectacle of books. At the end of this volume, we have John Gilpin, a delightful ballad and a charming example of Cowper's prim but sprightly humor. Among his other poems, we may mention On the Receipt of My Mother's Picture, which is extremely pathetic and moving, and the powerful but ghastly poem The Castaway, which sounds like the wail of a damned spirit. Cowper did not completely break away from the school of Pope. His avowed didactic purpose, he once wrote, I can write nothing without aiming at usefulness, and his occasional false refinement of diction connect him with the classical school of poetry. But in his broad humanity and in his attitude to nature, Cowper is in sympathy with the spirit of the French Revolution and the spirit of William Wordsworth. Next is John Crabbe, 1754 to 1832. Crabbe was a contemporary of Blake and the Romantic poets, but in method he is largely of the 18th century. His first poem was The Liberty in 1781, followed by The Village in 1783, which made his name as a poet. The newspaper came out in 1785 and then followed a gap of nearly a quarter of a century. But when Crabbe took up his poet's pen after this long interval, his manner was changed and his fidelity to the heroic couplets unshaken. The Paris Register was published in 1809, The Borough in 1810, Tales in Verse in 1812, and The Tales of the Hall in 1819. The poems show little development, and the years made no impression on Crabbe's style or manner. In his verse, he depicts the life of the poor in all its penury and its misery. He is an uncompromising realist, nature's sternest painter, yet her best, Byron, and never spares his readers the sordid realities. He never attempts to relieve the gloom and pessimism of his picture by a single idealizing touch. He tells himself, I paint the cot, as truth will paint it, and as bards will not. Crabbe lacks the supreme poetic gift of transforming even squalor and affliction into things of splendor and apparel or appeal, but he is sincere and sympathetic and a keen observer of human nature. We have had an occasion to mention Crabbe in connection with the development of naturalism, which was one of the phases of the Romantic movement. Next, we got Robert Burns, 1759 to 1796. Burns was a Scottish peasant who had a hard and bitter life. He possessed a powerful and lively mind, but often fell a prey to fits of acute depression. Drink and dissipation were his chief weaknesses, but he should not be judged too harshly, for he was no worse than many other men of his age. He rose to fame by publishing the Kilmarnock edition of 1786 entitled Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. The volume included such poems as Halloween to a Mouse, to a Mountain Daisy, and the Two Dogs, which are charged with the romantic spirit and have nothing of the formalism dear to the 18th century. The best work of the Burns is lyrical. His motive for Burns was an inspired egoist who was also a born singer. But within the limits of the lyric, he traverses an immense range of emotion and experience. Among his numerous songs and lyrics may be mentioned My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, As a Fond Kiss, and Then We, Sevier, of Mary's, At the Window Be, Go Fetch to Me a Pint of Wine, Duncan Gray, and Odd Long Syne. Such spontaneously sincere poems go straight to the heart, and perhaps more than any other 18th century poet, Burns is responsible for bringing passion back to English poetry. Humor and pathos are the notable quantities of his poetry, and all of them we find a wide range. Halloween is a picture of rustic merrymaking. The Jolly Beggars, an intensely realistic poem, is full of rollicking wit that often borders on coarseness. Tam O'Shanter's is remarkable for its Bachonism or Bacchanalian coarseness. Tam O'Shanter is okay, and apart from Bachonism flavor, it is known for its wistful charm. Burns can utter a piercing cry, as in a Fawn case. He can be pensively pessimistic, as in Ye Banks and Brace, gracefully sentimental, as in My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose, and bitterly scornful, as in The Holy Fair. Another characteristic of his poetry is its democratic quality, which is revealed in such poems as A Man's Man for a That. Burns is full of the growing spirit of the French Revolution with its three-worded slogan Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. His sympathy is broad indeed and extends to the animal creation. He is full of love for the horse and the dog, and even the mouse itself falls within the pale of his affection. We thus see that Robert Burns has little affinity with the classical school in the 18th century, but in his style he shows a curious double tendency, which is typical of the transition. When he writes in the correct manner, he has all the petty vices of the Augustan school, but far oftener he writes in his Scottish dialect and leaves far behind the still artificial poetic diction of the Poipian school. By writing in his native dialect, by portraying in his poetry the life of the Scottish peasant, and by rejoicing in descriptions of the Scottish scenery and customs, Burns becomes the national poet of England and holds a unique position. Then we got Blake. William Blake was an artist and a poet, and both his engravings and poems have been conceived wild and fantastic lines. It is not impossible to believe that his later pamphlets or prophetic books were the creation of an unsound mind, but to the ordinary reader, the poems which are of real value are contained in three little volumes: Poetical Sketches, 1783, Songs of Innocence, 1789, and the Songs of Experience, published in 1794. They contain some extraordinary fine lyrics written in very simple language. In simplicity of diction and style, Blake anticipates Wordsworth himself. Some lyrics are Little lamb who made thee, or Tiger, tiger, budding bright, or never seek to tell thy love, are worthy of the great or of the highest praise. In some of the lyrics, Blake shows Elizabethan influence. My silks and fine array has the Elizabethan wantonness of love. On the other hand, how sweet I roam from field to field anticipates the spirit and imagery of Keats' La Ballade and Saint's Mercy. William Blake was a mystic, and even those early lyrics have touches of mysticism in them. The mysticism went on deepening with time, so that his later works like Vala, Milton, or Jerusalem are almost unintelligible to most people. For these prophetic books, Blake invented a whole mythology of his own. Symbolism and mysticism became the breath of his being. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Everything about Blake is in revolt against the 18th century traditions and conventions. His love of mysticism is a very antithesis of correctness, and his diction, with its simplicity and naturalness, would not have been regarded as poetic by the school of Pope.